Welcome back. This is week 7, lecture 1, The Emergence of Christendom. And by this point, you should have, in any case, submitted your first exam. So the first part of the course is completed. But yet, this course, as most history courses, simply builds on everything that has come before. So the story continues. The storyline, the emplotment, at least in terms of my emplotment for these lectures, just continues. And again, as I said, I think preparing for the first midterm exam, that is all based on building towards the final exam. So that's where this is all still headed. And we kind of wrapped up that first part of the course with the first midterm with the so-called fall of Rome. In this lecture, we begin a new phase that I have under the title, The Emergence of Christendom, which I hope you will see what that means as we get going on it, but it is a process of changing paradigms. I've talked about paradigms before, and we see the end of antiquity and the beginning of something new, the Middle Ages. Scholars discuss when did the Middle Ages begin, and when did late antiquity end? How do we mark those things? And there's different demarcations. There are different events or points in time that we can say, oh, now we're in a different world than we had been previously. Now, obviously, or at least for me, it's obvious, but I can say that anytime we're doing history, in so many ways, every moment is unique. Every moment is a transition to the next successive moment. And so trying to say we have the end of a period at this point and the beginning at another point is all artificial. There is no absolute correct point of demarcation between two historical periods. That's why these periods of transition are often so studied, at least relatively, because you can, in some ways, make your career if you can show a new understanding of a transition from one period to another. All periodization is artificial. All periodization is artificial. It is what historians impose upon the interpretation of the past, which is based on the extant artifacts, the extant evidence. And we're going to be looking at some of that process as we go through this lecture, because we can say that by 300, Europe was still very much part of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was the dominant force in the world. But then by 600, things have completely changed. Now, traditionally, as I addressed before, that the change has been seen as the fall of Rome, defined as 476 with the deposition of the last Roman emperor in the West. But yet, as I tried to explain before the midterm, even though Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476 CE, the emperor remained in the East, and the kings, the Gothic kings in the West, still ruled underneath the emperor. So there was never an historical understanding, meaning at the time itself, of, oh my gosh, Rome has fallen. But there is a transformation. We do see indications of a huge shift. And in this 5th century, from approximately 400 to 500, things had radically changed when we look at administrative structures. Now, in 400, still, if you had asked Augustine of Hippo, is Rome about to fall? He said, "What? You're crazy. Theodosius has just pronounced Christianity the only legal religion of the empire. This is almost the culmination of this process." And then what happens? 410 happens. When Alaric, the Ostrogoth, sacks Rome, or as I try to portray it too, marches on Rome as a Roman general to restore order, to get what he needs from the Senate so that he can pay his troops so they can continue fighting for Rome on the borders. And that is where we're kind of looking at today, the borders north of the Alps into territories that were seen to be inhabited by non-Roman citizens, or even what's called Gallo-Romans, because Gaul was a major Roman province north of the Alps. There's Transalpine and Cisalpine Gaul. And so it kind of begins in the Alps, Cisalpine, kind of very much northern Italy, and then on into it, or into Britannia. And often, as I think I mentioned, this is where they would settle um, soldiers, members of the military, give them land. They became Roman citizens. So you have Roman citizens who were actually more of Germanic origin, and I think I even mentioned that Alaric was of Germanic origin, the Goths, and the term for these people often is just grouped under the term barbarian. Now, we talked about the origins of the term barbarian early on in terms of Greeks, or the Greece, well, the Greeks, in Greece, the Greeks, who referred to those people who did not speak Greek as the barbarians because they sounded like they were saying bar, 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 bar. That definition then by now has shifted to the non-Romans, the non-Latin speaking peoples. And so the Germanic tribes north of the Alps, or on the borders in general, were seen as barbarian because they are not Roman. And after 391, anyway, with Theodosius' proclamation of the Christianity as the only legal religion of Rome, so Christianity, proclaiming Christianity as the state religion of Rome, it also meant non-Christian. Now, all kinds of issues there. Some of these Germanic tribes were Arian Christians, as I think I mentioned. Arianism had been condemned at the Council of Nicaea in 325, but it was almost still an option. It was not. It was still seen as a heretic, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a minute, or shortly later on in this lecture. But it was not necessarily that if you were an Arian, you were going to be, captured, bound, and burned at the stake. That did not come about until much, much, much later, and not for Arianism. But so it's an issue of you're just wrong. You're wrong. And there was a sense of heresy and orthodoxy that had become established fairly early on, by around the year 100 or so, this division between heresy and orthodoxy. And that concept was still there, and that orthodoxy was the state policy of Rome. And so if you were a heretic, you're in this ambiguous legal status, because you weren't really right in terms of following the dictates of Rome and the state religion, but you weren't like a non-Christian. So it's a problem here. And the same thing with ethnicity when we talk about the Germans. So often we equate the Germans with all the various tribes that are non-Roman, quote unquote, non-Roman citizens in any case, and ethnically certainly not Roman, but as I think I've addressed before, there were no such things as ethnic Romans, except for maybe if you go back to and say, well, originally you were from the Latins or the Etruscans, which fused to form the Romans, and so there was a core sort of that was there that could be seen as Roman, but that core is very small. And so we have the issue of, let's say, ethnic Romans, ethnic Italians, and then Roman citizens. So what really constitutes being Roman? And the most general definition was being a Roman citizen, following the Roman legal administrative stipulations and customs and laws, and the Roman culture writ large, for which then, again, Virgil still provided the basic narrative or story in his Aeneid, the official account. So that's what we're looking at here. And so when we start finding mixings of people and infiltrations of Germanic peoples with Romans, or when Germanic peoples become Roman citizens, what does that all say to us about this concept barbarian? We need to kind of throw that out, and especially the concept German, because German at this time meant Germanic linguistic groups. There was a Roman province north of the Alps called Alemannia, and Alemannia in French is Germany, or German. There's lower and upper Germany in that sense. But there's not a political state. There are many actually different tribes. And we have a wonderful source actually from around the year 100 CE, written by the Roman historian Tacitus. And the title is simply on the Germans, De Germania, on the German territories, on the regions. And he goes through almost almost an ethnography of the various different tribes that consisted, and these were warring tribes. This was not a single group of the barbarians. And some of them he felt were more noble than the Romans at the time. He said, my gosh. He said, let's hope that the Germans keep fighting each other, because if they don't turn themselves against us, we're going to have a real problem. And that's why, too, Rome started using and aligning themselves with various Germanic peoples, various different Germanic tribes, offering them, land and support and protection, as long as they would fight for them against the, let's say, non-Romanized Germanic tribes, which they did. So especially along the borders, especially we're talking about north of the Alps in the European context, I'm not talking now about the eastern side of things. There's a real fusion and mixing of cultures, of ethnicities, of languages as we continue through the late antique period, and especially as we get into the 4th century. And I think I already mentioned too, and I'll address this when I get there in the next slide, the so-called fall of Rome, because I've kind of slipped already into the first slide, that there was never a real fall of Rome, but there was and began to be a real noticeable withdrawal and receding of Roman administrative authority and power. When the last Roman emperor is deposed, that led to this decrease of centralized authority in the north, i.e. north of the Alps. And what I mean by centralized is from Rome. The skeletal structure, the organizational structure in terms of the provinces and the dioceses, and then the bishops remained. Even after the rest of Roman administration kind of went by the wayside. It's also noted by trade. There had been significant trade back and forth across the borders with various Germanic peoples. That begins to very much recede, so that there's not even the possibility of trade in any substantial amount. And so that is what is going on here, this long-term transformation. It's not that Rome fell on 476 and now we're in something new. It is a long period of transition and transformation. That's what we're looking at. Now, I think, as I said, this is intended as an introduction, but I've slipped into the first slide, which is the Germanization of Rome and the Romanization of the barbarians, because that's really what was going on here. And just as I argued or posed the question, I believe, in terms of the Christianization of Rome, did Rome become Christian or did Christianity become Roman? That is a big question. And essentially, you could argue, well, both. It went both ways. We can't say it was one or the either, because Christianity certainly became Romanized as it became adopted by the Roman Empire as its official religion. And yet Rome became Christianized as it adopted Christianity as the official religion. But the same type of question we have to ask in terms of the Germanization of Rome and the Romanization of the barbarians, quote unquote barbarians. Now, I part of me would love to say that you were forbidden to use the word barbarian, but I'm not going to do that. But I want you to know very clearly how it's defined. And how it's defined in terms of this course is first as not Greek, the non-Greek speaking peoples. And then now, as we move into the 5th, into the 6th century, as we will in this lecture, as the non-Roman or non-Latin speaking peoples and non-Christian peoples. And I'll talk shortly too about what being a Christian at this time meant, especially among the Germans. It wasn't much, but that's what kind of the term referred to. So as long as you are aware, and I think it's central for you to be aware of what that term means, that term barbarian, and how it's used. The Germans didn't use it, oh yeah, we're barbarians, we want to become cultured. That's not what it was at all. It was like, we see things here in Rome that we might like, and we can see protection and a civilization that will be a benefit for our people. The Roman the barbarian invasions were not invasions, they were migrations often, in some ways, even if reluctantly, accepted and welcomed even by Rome. So we need to avoid this concept of barbarian invasions leading to the fall of Rome. That's the point behind all of this. Because as there is this increasing assimilation and acculturation, which is just the fusion of cultures and different peoples and ethnicities, which Rome had been all along. I think I even referred to Rome as a melting pot, the first great melting pot. And that just increases with these Germanic peoples becoming part of the empire on the borders. We see a fusion that becomes difficult to tell who's who and what's what. At one point in the 5th century, before 476, there was question over who was going to be the next emperor in the West, and Stilicho almost was appointed or elected emperor in the West. And Stilicho was thoroughly a Germanic general, a Gothic general. You can say, well, but the Goths were uneducated. Well, not really, because already in the 4th century, Wulfila was a Goth and was appointed as bishop to the Goths. Because as in the course of the 4th century, the Romans were more aware of the Goths. I mentioned, I think, in the lecture before the midterm, that the Goths defeated Hadrian at the battle, or no, Valens at the Battle of Hadrianopolis in 478. So the Romans were definitely aware of the Goths and knew about the Goths and had known about them for a long time. And so that it's an issue of, okay, well, if they are going to become assimilated to Rome, and if we're going to allow them within the empire, give them, incorporate them within the empire, assimilate them into the empire, they need to be Christians. So we need a bishop to the Goths. And Wulfila, Wulfila, I think, was appointed bishop to the Goths. And he himself was a Goth. He was a Goth. He was a quote-unquote barbarian. He had been educated in Rome and in Constantinople. He was fluent in Latin and in Greek. And one of the first tasks he set himself was to produce a translation of the Bible into Gothic. Because he said, if we're going to be Christians, we have to read the divine revelation, which is contained in the scriptures. And this is not just an issue of translation. Wulfila had to develop an entirely new written language of Gothic. There was the linguistic language that the Goths spoke, but they had not developed a written language. So Wulfila, in his endeavor to translate the Bible, had to come up with a new written language. And just think of, let's say, the brilliance of doing that. It's difficult. So we can't really say that the barbarians were uneducated Slavs if we talk about the barbarians as the Germanic peoples. Some of them surely would. And Tacitus, in his De Germania, going back again to 100 or so CE, talked about the difference of acculturation and the difference that some tribes are really barbaric, whereas others were very much, it's almost hard to, as I kind of said, hard to tell the difference between a Roman and a non-Roman. Just as there were really crude and uneducated and pretty barbaric Romans, if we use barbaric in that qualitative sense of uncultured, unlearned. So we need to be careful when we are using these terms, and that's the point I want to stress here when we're looking at these developments from the beginning of the 5th century through the 6th and 7th. We'll get almost into the 8th century in this lecture. Now, what do we see here? We see, once we have the withdrawal of Roman administration in the West and the so-called fall of Rome after the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476, we find the emergence of various Germanic kingdoms. That's really what I'm talking about, various Germanic kingdoms. But we should not think too much about the term kingdom as we apply it to these Germanic different tribes. The basis of Germanic society was something called the comitatus. That is, in Latin, it was called the comitatus, which really it was the German warrior band. It was a group of warriors in their wives and daughters and sons, who would go on raiding parties and fight other bands of Germanic warriors, trying to establish for themselves a place to live in peace and harmony. That's what they were looking for and wanting. And they were led by what the Romans could only refer to as a king. Why do I say only the Romans could refer to as a king? Because the leader of these groups, was seen as the first among equals. I'll tell a story shortly about that. Very on how clearly that's the case. So they were seen as first among equals, even though it was recognized that people would follow their king or their leader. Now, there began to be emerging in the course of the later 5th century one of these Germanic kingdoms, as it's called, which is simply a Germanic warrior band writ large, so to speak, that was to have the most impact on the development of the West, quote unquote, the West, from this point on, namely the group of Germanic peoples known as the Franks. So if we turn now to the next slide, we find the Franks. Now the Franks were one of a number of Germanic tribes. Tacitus doesn't talk about the Franks. And I'm not sure if they were even identified as a specific peoples in approximately 100 CE. It could have been. I'm not a historian of the Franks. But by the 5th century, they were a couple of different major groupings of Franks, the Ripuarian Franks and the Salian Franks. And in the later 5th century, those two different groups of Franks were united under their king, Clovis. Now, so they had the kingdom of the Franks. In the Frankish language, the term that Romans translated as Franks simply meant the people. So they refer to themselves, we are the people. We're just the people. But once we have the unification of the Franks, we have a single people that identified and understood themselves as a single people, led by a ruler, or even if still first among equals. And this group that we designate as the Franks was to influence the entire rest of the development of Western civilization, so that we cannot understand Western civilization whatsoever unless we have an understanding of the Franks. Now, we know a lot about the Franks, not as much as we know about other groups in more modern times, because still we're talking here about the late 5th century and the early 6th century and to the 7th and 8th centuries. We have an increasingly extant number of sources. And this is where we get into the term the Dark Ages, because unlike with Greece, I talked about the Greek Dark Ages from approximately 1200 BCE or 1100 BCE to approximately 800 to 750 BCE. We refer to that as the Dark Ages, not because it's a qualitative darkness, but because there are no sources. We can't see into that period. The problem with referring to the early Middle Ages or the Middle Ages such as the Dark Ages is not that there is a lack of sources. Now, there are, for the, let's say, the later 5th century through the 8th century, there's a lesser number of sources, but there are sources available. It has been called dark, basically, by Renaissance humanists who gave the very negative moniker to the Middle Ages, the Medium Aevum. In Latin, it's used in the singular, the Medium Aevum, which is the source of our term medieval, Medium Aevum, is a singular. And in some of the Romance languages, in German, it's Das Mittelalter, the Middle Age. In French is Le Moyen Age, the Middle Age. In Dutch is the Middeleeuwen, plural. And in English we use the plural too. I don't know what it is in Spanish. Sorry. But this use of the singular comes from, again, the early or late 14th, early 15th century Renaissance humanists in Italy, who said that we are affecting a rebirth of classical culture and learning, and what has become between us and ancient Rome and then Greece was just been one long dark Middle Age. And that has been taken up by the 19th century German, or actually Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt in his book on the civilization of Italy and the Renaissance, which set the field of Renaissance studies. It has ever since. And they look back on medieval developments and see them as backwards, and see them as dark, as unfulfilling. Now, I may touch briefly on the Renaissance in later lectures. There's a long story behind that, which I won't bore you with, so to speak. If you're interested, let me know. I'll happily go into it. We have enough to cover without going into all my reasons why I have issues with the Renaissance. But the point is that there are sources. Now, is there a decline in classical learning? Yes, there is. Much like the withdrawal of Roman administration as we go into the 5th century, the 6th century, especially from the later 5th century to the 6th century and 7th century, classical learning really recedes and almost disappears. It does. The Platonic Academy, for example, was closed in 529. And that is perhaps as good a date to hang the end of late antiquity on as any other, because that is all of a sudden the teaching of Plato and of Aristotle and classical education is no more. So there is this real decline in what had been seen as the classical tradition. That is evident too in the major source that we have for the Franks, namely Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks. Gregory of Tours was a bishop of Tours. He was a Gallo-Roman, so he was not himself a Frank. He dies, I think it's in 604 CE, and he writes about the history of the Franks. Now, Gregory's History of the Franks is fantastic, and I would love to have assigned it for this course, but it's very thick, and sometimes very detailed. It's also marvelous stories. But Gregory starts off by apologizing for his lack of ability with Latin. He says, now before I get going, I need to apologize unless I offend against taste or grammar or good Latinity, because I know my knowledge and education is not what it should be, not what it used to have been. But, he says, there's no one else around who can write the history of the Franks. And it needs to be preserved so we understand basically what God has done with the Franks. So we can remember. And that is hearkening back to Herodotus and his History of the Persian Wars, where Herodotus starts off by saying, I, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, when I write about the great deeds of the Greeks and the barbarians, lest they fade away into oblivion. Once things can be recorded, they can be preserved and remembered. And that is what Gregory was trying to do with the people of Franks, the people with whom he ruled over as bishop in the Diocese of Tours, and whom he lived with, and many of whom he knew. Now, the first few books of Gregory's History of the Franks go back before he was around. But the later books are all history he lived through. He knew these people. He advised these people, and he's writing about them. And these are fantastic stories, and I will refer to only a couple as we go through. But the whole point here is he said that, this is my history, and because it needs to be done, but I'm sorry if anybody reads this and finds it to be offensive to Latinity. He was aware of this decline. You say, well, whom is he imagining is going to be reading this? Well, maybe he imagined that people back in Rome might read it, or people in Constantinople might read it. He wasn't aware that when he's writing this at the end of the 6th century, people in Constantinople couldn't really read Latin anymore much at all anyway. He probably wasn't aware of that. But based on the standards of classical education, they were still very much present in the end of the 4th century, early 5th century. Augustine was extremely well educated. So Boethius, who is a 6th century figure, was executed by, that's a whole other wonderful story, by Theodoric, the king of Italy, another Goth. So knew that the knowledge of Greek was disappearing. So he set himself out to translate all of Plato and Aristotle from Greek into Latin, because Boethius was also one of the last classically educated individuals in the West. He didn't get very far before he was executed for treason, which was a trumped-up charge. It was ridiculous. It was funny because I think I mentioned that Odoacer had arranged with the emperor in the east to depose Romulus Augustulus. Well, then Theodoric had arranged with the emperor in the east to depose Odoacer, which he did. And then Theodoric was like, I don't want that to happen. And there were rumors going around and around that Boethius was part of a coup to get rid of Theodoric. And Boethius was one of his top advisors. But Theodoric had him arrested. Boethius denied it. And then Boethius was in prison, awaiting execution. And he writes this book called The Consolation of Philosophy, which too I would love to have assigned. It's really short, and so if you ever really want a fantastic read that also you might find very insightful and helpful, get a copy of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. But there, this is another issue in terms of the change and transformation. Lady Philosophy appears to him in a dream. And there's all kinds of issues in terms of dream literature and personifications and those things, which would be fun to go into, but we don't have the time here. And Boethius had forgotten, and he's bewailing his fate. And Philosophy says, what are you talking about? Why are you complaining? It's the wheel of fate. It wasn't due to your own skills and wonderfulness when you were on top of the world, when you were serving as the advisor to the king, when both of your sons simultaneously served as consuls of the empire. Blah, 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 blah. Now, that point. And this is in the early 6th century, after the so-called fall of Rome. And yet, Boethius's 2 sons served as joint consuls, meaning that goes back to the Roman constitution. Consuls were the head of the Roman Republic, the 2 consuls. And even though there was the Augusti, there was still the Senate was led by consuls. And so the Senate was still there in Rome and still had consuls. So that is what I'm talking about in terms of this so-called fall of Rome. And then Boethius, had to come around and realize that that's not indeed that he had forgotten about philosophy and blah, 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 blah. It's a fantastic work. But the point is he didn't get very far in translating Plato and Aristotle. So consequently, from this point on, very few works of Aristotle were known. His basic logical works were known, the categories, the prior analytics. I'm not sure about the posterior analytics. I have to go back and look at that. I think so, but not sure. But his natural philosophy was not there, and his more advanced logical works were not there. The only work of Plato that was known was the oh gosh, Eric, I can't believe it's the cosmological work of his, not the Theogony. I can't come up with the name. I'm sorry. This is really embarrassing for me because I know it. I know it well, but it was not Boethius' translation. It had been translated by somebody else. There had been, there's a translation of Euclid's Geometry, which also not by Boethius, but from Greek into Latin. Chalcidius made a number of translations into Latin, but the point being is that overall the access in Latin to classical education, which was heavily influenced by Greek thought and Greek texts, and when you're bilingual, you don't need a translation, was affected and declined. And so what was available in the Latin West was only a minuscule part of the classical tradition and heritage. And we'll see later when we get there in terms of how that was all recovered. That is another story. And for the most part, it was recovered far before the Italian Renaissance, but I'll get there when I get there. So that's what the period that we're looking at. I know this is kind of going off on a tangent, but I want to give you the sense of the period. And when Clovis is then unites the Franks and is king of the Franks. And then what happens? Clovis finally converts to Christianity, to Roman Christianity, following the Pope, not to Arianism. And Gregory talks about Clovis's conversion. He does not talk about the fall of Rome, but he talks about Clovis's conversion. And he emphasizes that he converted from being a barbarian, a pagan barbarian, to being a Christian. But for him, for Gregory, that meant a Roman Christian because the Arians were heretics. Gregory also started out his history of the Franks with his confession of his own faith, because he says, I want everybody to know where I believe, and I am a firm Nicene Christian. And this is what I believe. And also Gregory, who's a Christian bishop, keep in mind, says, I'm going to tell you about the history of the Franks, but to do so, I need to give you some background. So, to begin, in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. He goes through the whole history of creation in the first book, opening, in the first few chapters, until he gets to the Franks and the origins of the Franks in the 5th century. Now, Gregory wasn't alive in the 5th century. But he knew stories, and he knew people who did know people who were alive at the time. And so he's writing these things. Now, Gregory, even though he's a Christian bishop, he's not a moralizer in any way, shape, or form. And some of the stories he reports, all the horrific acts of these Franks, is what we're talking about more, without real condemnation. Yes, he wants them to be Christian, but at the time, being Christian meant being baptized and attending Christian worship. That's all it meant. And the story of Clovis's conversion is illustrative of that. So how did it happen? Well, Clovis had married a Bavarian princess, Bavarian, Germanic tribe, who had been a Catholic, who converted to Catholicism, Roman Christianity, not Arianism. And his wife kept bugging him about becoming Christian. And Clovis is like, you got to be kidding me. I'm not going to do that. Why would I want to do that? It's just a weird religion. And then they had a child, and his wife insisted that the child was be baptized, and the child was baptized and then was sickly and died. Did not survive infancy, basically. And Clovis was very upset. He said, that's what happens when you follow your religion. I'm going to continue following mine. Well, his wife continued, and Clovis continued resisting until one day he was fighting a battle against another Germanic tribe, and he was losing. Clovis was losing. And was in retreat. And he stopped and he prayed. And he said, Lord Jesus Christ, my wife believes in you. I don't. But my gods certainly aren't doing anything to help here. If you will help me win this battle, I will believe in you and become a follower of yours. And as Gregory of Tours reports it, at that very moment, all of a sudden Clovis's forces regrouped and put the enemy to flight and ended up having a decisive, outstanding victory. And Clovis became Christian. He was baptized. And what does that mean? That means not only Clovis was baptized, every Frank was baptized. His entire army was baptized. I'm not saying everybody within the Frankish territory was, but that was the whole point. The whole realm became Christian. They were baptized, and then they would have Christian worship, going to Mass. I can talk a lot more about the conversion of the barbarians. That would also kind of take us more afield. In my early medieval course, I do teach a course in the early Middle Ages. I haven't offered it for a while. Not my choice. I would love to offer it regularly every other year or so. But we talk a lot more about that aspect. But the point here is that it's not wasn't a matter of, oh, I see the light, I'm convert. Thank you, Lord Jesus. It wasn't that type of conversion. It wasn't even like Paul going to Emmaus and being struck down. It was like, will you help me in battle? Now we've heard that before. We've heard that story before. The same story. Constantine, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Gregory of Tours, I already said, recognized that he wasn't as educated as had been the case, but he knew that story. Now, can I prove that he knew that story? No. There may be some scholars who can. He gets it from Eusebius. It comes from Eusebius, and Eusebius was available. And so, but the point is that it seems clear that he knew that story. So he's making the association, the analogy, or the allusion of Constantine and Clovis. Constantine being the first great quote-unquote Christian emperor, even though I talked about that. We talked about Constantine, how it wasn't baptized, so that it was his life on his deathbed. But he was making that point. Everything that Constantine did for Christianity, Clovis is going to do that for the Franks. Now, another story I can't help but say. Before Clovis was baptized and converted. And this gets back in terms of the first among equals. Gregory of Tours tells the story of Soissons. There had been this raiding party that Clovis had led into another area of another bishop. I forget which. And the Franks under Clovis had raped, pillaged, and plundered and took all their booty back to their camp. And they were camping in Soissons. And they went to divide the spoils. Now, the bishop went to Clovis, or talked to Clovis before he went back to camp, and said, you got all this stuff, but there's this one ewer, which is like a chalice kind of thing, plate, chalice. It's very special to me. Is there any way I could get it back? Now, Clovis had established a good relationship with the bishop. Bishops were territorial administrators, we have to keep in mind. And Clovis said, well, if that piece comes to my part of the booty, I will return it to you. Bishop says, thank you. So the Franks under Clovis are getting together at Soissons to divide up the booty. And Clovis addresses his troops and says, okay, guys, I know I'm your king, but I have a special request this time. In addition to my normal share of the booty, I would like to ask for this specific ewer. All the men said, of course, our king, you're our king. Basically all of this is yours. It's yours. But this one guy comes out with his battle axe and smashes the ewer. And says, no, you will not get one piece more than your fair share. What did Clovis do? Clovis gritted his teeth and took it. Because he knew the guy had a point. Went their merry way. Several months later, Clovis got his revenge. He called together his troops for an inspection. So, okay, everybody line up. Went through. And it came to the guy who'd smashed the ewer. And Clovis starts saying, look at you. You're in such slovenly conditions. Your clothes aren't well kept. Your weapons are in bad shape. Your helmet's in bad shape. He knocks the guy's helmet off. And he takes his battle axe and throws it to the ground. He says, what is this problem with you? He says, no, pick up your axe. The guy bends over to pick up his axe. And Clovis, with his battle axe, smashes the guy's skull and says, that is what you did to my ewer in Soissons. Now, Gregory doesn't moralize on this. He just tells the story. I'm sure it made a big impression on all the other Franks. It's like, well, thank God that we didn't question it. Oh, no, certainly we're not going to, because look what could happen. The point here is that Clovis accepted that point. He got his revenge, but he accepted that point. the morals of the Franks didn't really change by becoming Christian. And we'll see that maybe too if I can tell some more fun stories without going over time, I hope. I need to get going on this because I'm already taking more time than I thought I would be because these stories are just too fun. This is how we know about the Franks and Gregory. Gregory is not the only source, Gregory's history of the Franks. He's not the only source we have, but he is the major source that we have for the Franks. So we have Clovis's conversion, and from this point on, the kings of the Franks. And Clovis is the first Rex Francorum, the king of the Franks. And he was from the family that became known as the Merovingians. And so we have the Merovingians coming from Clovis. Actually, supposedly, it goes back to an ancestor of Clovis named Merovec, one of Clovis's great-grandfathers, I think it was. But as a dynasty ruling. And they had established hegemony over Central Europe. So that was a pretty major development. Rather than simply warrior bands, we now have a political entity, the Kingdom of the Franks, north of the Alps in Central Europe. The emperor in the east recognized Clovis's kingship and authority, sent him the purple, the imperial, not the imperial regalia, but the purple color, so that Clovis was ruling as king of the Franks underneath the emperor. And Gregory was, not that because he wasn't there with Clovis, was writing about this and talking about this whole development. And because Clovis had converted to Catholic Christianity, to Orthodox Roman Christianity. Catholic just means universal. There began to be this alliance in a non-specific sense. And the reason I say that is because there's going to be a specific technical alliance coming up. But an alliance between the papacy, or the Pope, and Clovis, the Kingdom of the Franks, against the Arians, who were not followers of Rome, and there's still the barbarians, the pagans, the non-Christians. That was important. And so we talk about Merovingian Europe as really being the late 5th into the 6th century, 7th century, into the 8th century, when the Franks establish themselves, are allied with the papacy, and are not ruling all of Europe, but are the major political force in Northern Europe. Now, what happens? This gets us to the next slide, which is the Franco-Papal Alliance. Because I just said it's not a technical term. The Franco-Papal Alliance is not Clovis converting to Roman Christianity, adherence to Rome. That was an alliance, but not the Franco-Papal Alliance. I'll get there. But to get there, I have to tell more of the stories. And yeah, I'm going to leave off telling some of the fun stories from Gregory of Tours and to prove to you that the morals of the Franks were not anything that we would consider to be Christian today whatsoever, and that Gregory, even if he didn't approve of, simply told about. So there's this issue with the later Merovingians on to the 6th century when Gregory didn't live with these people. And these are the people he knew and lived. So he's, I'm not going to say he's an eyewitness to these accounts, but he was there with these people as these things were going on. Queen, because there was after Clovis dies in 511. His conversion is somewhere around 495 or so. Historians debate that a bit. It's late 5th century. Then he dies in 511. And then it kind of breaks up because even though he was king of the Franks, for the Franks, it's very much a sense of this is my land. This is our land, my land. The concept of a state or a crown independent from the ruler was a much later development. At this point, this is a personal realm. This is a personal realm. Or empire, whatever you want to call it. Kind of like, a Jeff Bezos model or a Bill Gates model, i.e., there's not a state of Microsoft or a state of what is Jeff Bezos? It's Amazon. I guess Amazon is the parent company. So that's kind of what this is getting at, because it's still kind of like their personal possessions. Anyway, so it kind of disintegrates by either inheritance and splitting it up, and we'll see that again because it splits up several times until there's this sense of. So it's divided between his surviving sons. There's warring factions among them, and among one of the factions, the king was killed, and the uncles come in, and there are sons, their nephews, who are young boys, and they tell the queen, they say, "Okay, we're going to get rid of your sons. You have a choice. We can either kill them or we can send them to a monastery." There's that aspect. I'll get to monasticism later too, not in this lecture, but in a couple lectures down the road. And she said, can't have them cut their hair. Might as well just kill them. Now, what was the whole thing with cutting their hair? That goes back to, earlier on, because within the Merovingians, because they became known as the long-haired kings. The hair was a symbol of power and authority. You say, "Oh, that's weird, isn't it?" Well, yeah, but it's also biblical. Samson, if you know the Old Testament story of Samson and Delilah. Samson was a very strong man, and Delilah, cut his hair off, and he lost all of his strength. So there was a symbol of royal office. It's long hair. So the queen says, "No, that's too horrible. Might as well kill him." So the uncles take the three boys out and they kill him. And even the last one is pleading for his life, saying, "Uncle, please don't kill me." And one of the uncles says, "Okay, maybe not." The other one says, "Oh, basically you wuss," and goes and just stabs him anyway and kills him. And the queen later kind of regretted that, but that was at the time. And Gregory doesn't say how horrible this is. He's just talking about the family dynamics and what's going on with the Franks and the rulership. Anyway, I'll leave that there and go on. The whole point is that the Merovingians from, let's say 500 is a rough term. I mean, even though Clovis had united the Franks in the 480s. From the 480s CE until the mid 8th century ruled Central Europe. But they became known not only as the long-haired kings, but also as the do-nothing kings. Now, in this time, too, that they faced a new threat, namely the rise of Islam, because Muhammad dies in 632. And not going into the whole story, the development of Islam, except as it pertains to our story here, started to spread through North Africa and on into Europe, on into Spain. And it was the Franks that stopped the further progression of Islam. So if you kind of think on a map, so you have, I know this is backwards, so it's not going to really make much sense, but if you have Europe here, you have the Middle East here, it spread through North Africa and up then into Spain, and to keep the further eastern expansion, the Franks stopped it. And they stopped it under the generalship of a man by the name of Charles Martel, known as Charles the Hammerer. Charles Martel was not the king of the Franks. He was what was called the mayor, M-A-Y-O-R, mayor, the mayor of the palace. So I'll put on there on the slide, the mayor of the palace. It was a new office. And it was essentially like being the Prime Minister of England today, or not like it was analogous to. The king, by this time, after 3 centuries of ruling, was like, I don't want to get my hands dirty with all this stuff. I don't want to have to actually fight or do much of anything. I just want to enjoy being king. It's good to be king. They weren't called do-nothing kings for nothing at the time. So they appointed Charles to be what's called the first mayor of the palace to run things, including leading the armies, because that's what the Frankish leaders always had done. That's what their primary job was, just like Roman generals and everything. And Charles Martel, at the Battle of Tours, or Battle of Montpellier, depending on how you want to date it, it refers to the same events. In 732, so a century after Muhammad's death, defeats the Islamic forces in Spain and puts an end to their further progress. So he's seen as this kind of the savior of Central Europe, the Frankish territory. Now, from this point on, is Islam, which will become known as the Turk, becomes a major factor in the development of what I'll be talking about next week and then later of Christendom, which becomes a new myth of the West. Within the myth of the West, we have the myth of the West being the myth of Christendom during this part. And it's what this lecture is all about, which I'm still getting to. And it was developed in the context of what one scholar, famous scholar, Henri Pirenne, French scholar, said was like an island within a Muslim territory and sea. He said that the Mediterranean became an Islamic stronghold, so Europe becomes like an island within Islamic with very little interaction. The scholars since Pirenne, that was in the 30s, had put forward this fantastic thesis that was the foundation of so much scholarship and so much new understanding and discovery of sources and developments and everything else. Because all of a sudden people start attacking it, and there's no better way to move scholarship forward than to put forth the thesis that even if it ends up being proven inaccurate, still is the basis of so much scholarship. And that was like the Pirenne thesis. You have to learn the Pirenne thesis but then the counter argument was, no, we can still see long distance trade. It wasn't like Islam had Europe in a stranglehold at all. There was interaction, but they were seen as the infidel by the Europeans or by the Franks, by the Frankish realm and territories, as well as by the papacy and so. And so there was this is of the enemy without. We have to be wary and guard up. But looking at the internal development, then Charles Martel stopped this development and was seen as a hero. Now, his son, Pepin, I forget exactly when Charles dies, but Pepin starts to rule later on. The son of Charles Martel. And Pepin, too, is the mayor of the palace. In 768, actually, it's earlier, sorry, he dies in 768. In 751, he writes to the Pope. Now, we have his letters and the Pope's responses. I'm going to summarize those for you very briefly and colloquially. Basically, Pepin says, "Dear Pope, hope you're doing well. I have a question for you. Who should be king? He with the power or he with the title? Love, Pepin." P.S. By the way, I hear you're having troubles with the Lombards. Now, the Lombards were another Germanic tribe, and they had come into northern Italy. If you think of a map of Europe, the Italian peninsula here, Rome is basically in central Italy, and the north is still today called Lombardy, and that is where the Lombards were. And the Lombards were not Christians, and they were encouraging and making incursions into territories that the Pope felt should be his, and these are infidels or pagans anyway. So that's what Pepin wrote, kind of putting the screws to him. And the Pope writes back, "Dear Pepin, got your letter. Thank you very much. I'm doing just fine. Thank you. Hope you're well. I've thought about your question. And it seems to me that it's very clear that he with the power should be king. Love, the Pope. P.S. Yeah, I am having problems with the Lombards. If there's anything you can do to help, that'd be great." Now, that's a caricature, a colloquial caricature of the letters, but essentially that's what's going on. And that gave Pepin the authority, in his mind, to depose the last Merovingian king, cut off his hair, send him to a monastery, and proclaims himself king of the Franks. And Pepin was from another dynasty, coming from Charles Martel. And Charles in Latin is Carolus. So beginning with the family of Charles Martel, we talk about the Carolingians. We have the Merovingians and then the Carolingians. And the Carolingians' power and authority begins really with Charles Martel. And then with Pepin, Pepin as a Carolingian ruler becomes king of the Franks and establishes the Carolingian dynasty. This exchange of letters back and forth has become known by historians as the Franco-Papal Alliance. Because what Pepin did was then take his troops, go across the Alps, go into Italy, and he doesn't defeat the Lombards, but he gives a huge buffer zone to the Pope, beats back the Lombards, and creates a zone, a political territorial zone for the Pope. The Pope will be the ruler of. This was the creation of the Papal States, what became known as the Papal States. Now, today, in Rome, there's something called Vatican City. Vatican City is a relatively small enclave within Rome. Vatican City is its own sovereign state. It's not part of Rome. There are ambassadors to the Vatican. It is an independent sovereign state. And if you ever go to Rome, you should use if you've been, you know what I'm talking about. You should use the Vatican Post Office because the Vatican Post Office, at least last time I was there, still functions relatively okay, whereas the Italian Post Office is a god-awful mess. You can never be sure if your letter is going to get there or not. Now, of course, we don't use postage and letters that much anymore. But the point being is that they have their own police force or military, namely the Swiss Guards. It's their own state. A sovereign state is the Vatican. If we just take that and blow it up to all of central Italy, that's what Pepin created. So that the Pope would be the ruler, the temporal ruler of central Italy under the protection of the King of the Franks. And that was in exchange for making Pepin the King of the Franks by legitimating his deposing his predecessor. That is the Franco-Papal Alliance that emerges in the course of the 751 to 754 CE. That's what we're talking about. And here we begin to see the emergence of Christendom, which only would come about thoroughly and fully with the reign of Pepin's son, Charles, because Pepin dies in 768 and his son Charles takes over. It's another wonderful story, which I'll be getting to. And with Charles, again in Latin, is Carolus. So Charles was a Carolingian ruler, the greatest Carolingian ruler. And he was known as a great ruler. So he started to being referred to as the Great. He was known in English as Charles the Great, or in Latin as Carolus Magnus, the Great Carolus Magnus the Great, or in French, Charlemagne. And with Charlemagne, we have the real emergence of Christendom fully developed as a geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship. Is there a belief system? Sort of. Is there a culture, morality? Not really. It is baptism and Christian worship. Bishops are in place. There's this tension there. And Charlemagne would basically complete, not entirely, but almost the Christianization of the peoples north of the Alps in what we refer to as Europe. Not completely, but almost so. And did so with military conquest. So when the borders of the Carolingian realm, which was becoming a Carolingian empire, expanded. That's the expansion of Christendom. Because the same thing applies. We'll be talking more about this next lecture. The same thing applies as it did with Clovis. When you convert, everybody converts. We'll be talking more about that again next lecture when we talk about the world of Charlemagne, the world of the Carolingians. Because Christendom, it's important to understand this concept, became the overarching myth or ideology, or that which allowed people to understand their world, make sense of their world, from this point on until the early 16th century. Because with Charlemagne, it begins with Franco-Papal Alliance, Charlemagne, the Franks, and what Charlemagne was able to achieve. And that is what I'll be talking about next lecture. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.